Hi everybody, this is Doug with Doug Johnson Productions, and I wanted to take a little bit of time today to talk about the pan tilt zoom camera that I use for my video production. I've had an awful lot of questions about that in the comments for my videos, so I thought it might be worthwhile to take a little bit of time and go over, talk about what that camera is, why I selected it, and compare it to some of the other ones that are actually out on the market. So the camera that I'm actually using is this one right here. It's the Sony SRG-300SE. The S in the model name indicates that it has an SDI output, and the E indicates that it has an Ethernet interface for controlling the camera. Most of the cameras in Sony's pan tilt zoom range are controlled over RS-422, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that protocol, but it's one additional interface that I'd have to worry about and one additional cable that I'd have to run when I'm setting things up. And so I chose to go with this model, which allows all the control of the camera to be done over its Ethernet jack. This camera also does 3G SDI, so it can do 1080p, 60, 5994, or 50, and it even supports both level A and level B for the 3G signals. Of course, it also supports HD SDI and SD SDI as well, so you can use it with when you're doing video production in environments that don't support the 3 gig. It's actually quite small. And take a look at this thing, and it's probably only about 8 inches tall, 6 inches wide, and about 7 inches deep. It doesn't weigh very much either. It's actually pretty light. Build quality is okay. It's plastic, as you would assume. It's not something that's going to survive if it is on a tripod and it gets knocked over onto concrete. But for normal, just moving it here and there, it actually works okay. So let's actually turn this thing around and look at the ports on the back. So starting on this side right here, we have the power input. I did something unique with this, and I'll go over that in more detail in a minute, but basically I'm providing power over Ethernet to this camera so that I only have to run an Ethernet and SDI cable to the camera. But the camera does require power, 12 volts. For those who want to try this on their own, this is not a standard DC barrel jack. It is an EIAJ4 connector. It took me a while to figure that out, and took me just as long to find a supplier for that. But once I found the supplier, I just put that on the end of the cable, and now I can power the camera over Ethernet. The camera, of course, does come with its own power supply, so if you're installing it somewhere permanently, you just run AC power to that location and then use the supplied power adapter. Next we have the Ethernet jack. This not only provides the commands for the camera, this camera actually is capable of doing IP streaming over the internet or over your local intranet. It can supply 3 video streams, 3 different ones, and 3 different resolutions and frame rates. It supports H.264 and Motion JPEG, I think, is the other format. I don't use those features, so I'm not entirely familiar with them, but the camera does provide the capability of streaming video. It does it in one of 2 ways. It can either have clients connect directly to the camera, and there's a limit of just a handful of clients if you do it that way, or it can send the video via, I think it's RTSP is what the protocol is called, to a remote server somewhere and have it distribute. Sony advertises the fact that this camera works with the Wowza service that's out there. And so basically you do it, you put in the name of the Wowza server and some authentication information into the camera, and you're off and running. And the camera just streams directly out to the internet, and from there it's actually distributed. So this camera would actually be very good in distance learning scenarios. You set up one of these in the back of the classroom, and with 30 times optical zoom and smooth motion, you could actually produce a decent quality video with just the one camera. All right, going back to the back of the camera again. The next connection we have here is SDI. As I said before, that's 3 gig SDI. So again, do 1080p, 60 frames per second on that. Okay, next up here we have, this is the RS-422 interface for the VISCA command protocol. This is what most Sony PTZ cameras actually use. This one, it's provided as an option, but I'm using Ethernet in order to do the communication with the camera. But it's nice to know that that RS-422 is there in case you need to integrate with an existing VISCA-based PTZ setup that you've got. The last 2 jacks are an RCA connection for an audio input and then there is a eighth inch jack for microphone input. Now, one thing that ought to be mentioned about this, and I discovered this the hard way, those audio inputs only send audio to the IP streams. They do not get embedded in the SDI video output. And so if you're doing SDI, those jacks are basically worthless to you. They won't do anything. So, and don't get caught in a situation like I did where I assumed I could send audio from an audio mixer for a concert that I was doing through the camera to my switcher. It doesn't work. So I had to, last minute, go and grab a pile of XLR cables and run a separate audio feed manually. So one thing that I've done on the back of this camera, I actually put a level on there. So normally I put this camera on a tripod that has an adjustable head on it, which can be moved to any angle. And in order to make sure that it's level, it's really important when you're panning and tilting to make sure that your camera is level. So I put the two-directional level on there on the back, and I'd recommend that anybody using these things do the same. Picked them up on Amazon for like $3 for a package of 10 or something ridiculously low. So in terms of the capabilities for panning and zooming, the camera can actually pan plus or minus 170 degrees, so 340 degrees in total. And then as far as the tilt, it can tilt up to 20 degrees down and 90 degrees up. So you get 110 degrees of tilt on that. It will do the pan and tilt anywhere from 0.1 degrees per second up to 101 degrees per second. 101 is on the pan. The tilt doesn't go quite as fast. It's limited to about 90 degrees per second. But either way, they're both pretty fast. You can do almost a full 360 in just a little over 3 seconds on the pan, and go from the lowest position on the tilt up to vertical in just over a second as well. But on the slow side, because it will go up to 0.1 degrees per second, you can actually get some really nice smooth moves even if you're really zoomed in. I'll actually demonstrate that here. So switch to my camera number 1 here, and then I will do a pan to the right at the slowest speed the camera can move. This camera is about 8 feet away from the subject that I'm shooting here, and it's moving, but it's moving very, very slowly. So even if your camera is fairly far away and you need to do a fairly slow, smooth pan, it's capable of doing that. So you can see that it's capable of panning and tilting in a nice, smooth manner. That said, though, there is one little glitch in here, and I'll actually zoom in to make it a little easier to see. When you reverse direction vertically, there's a little bit of a jolt at the beginning of the shot. So when you're starting to make the move. So it's moving vertically, and then if I reverse and go down, there's a little bit of a jerk to it. As I'm going down, and I'll switch to going back up again, there's a little bit of a jerk at the beginning of that. This is actually a problem with this model. It's not a problem with this particular camera. So it's apparently a limitation of the design of the camera. Maybe there's some gears in there that just don't mesh quite right. I'm not sure exactly what the cause of that is, but it's something you need to be aware of, because if you're gonna cut to a shot where you're moving vertically and upwards and then start to move downwards, there's going to be that little bit of a jump when you start to move downwards again. So something to keep in mind. I recommend staying with one direction as you're moving through a shot. So if you start to move up, continue moving up. You can stop moving vertically. You just don't want to start moving back down again. Otherwise, you'll get that little bit of a jerk. It's not super noticeable when you're shooting at a wide angle, but it is definitely noticeable when you're zooming in, if you know that it's there. So just something to be aware of. Let's see. Pan speeds, there are 128 speeds to choose from, so you can actually vary quite smoothly from super slow to very fast. Same thing with tilt. Zoom, not so much. The zoom is somewhat limited. So there's the slowest zoom out, and then there's the fastest, and then fastest back in, and then the slowest move back in. And there's only a total of 8 speeds that it can do. So if you watch for it, you can actually see the transition from one speed to the next. So it's not as smooth on the zoom, transitioning between speeds on the zoom as I would like. But there are some good things about the zoom. It's 30 times optical, so you have a pretty wide range. You can go pretty wide and then really narrow in. And the other thing is the digital zoom, which can go up to 12 times, is really good for being a digital zoom. In the past, I've always stayed away from doing any sort of a digital zoom, just because it gets pixelated and noisy and soft. This one, not quite so much. It's actually pretty usable up to about 3 times. So between the 30 times optical and then another 3 times on top of that, that's about a 90 times zoom on this camera that I actually find to be fairly usable. The downside to that is that because this is not a fixed aperture lens, as you zoom in, the image can get darker if your aperture is not set small enough in order to prevent that from happening. So the solution, make sure you're stopped down. You might need to be at f5, f6, somewhere in that range, in order to make sure that as you're zooming that your exposure doesn't change on you. So again, something to be aware of. And when you have an aperture that small, you need to be in an environment that has a lot of light, or you put a lot of gain on the image. In terms of the quality of the image, generally speaking, it's actually very good. I wouldn't have a problem using this camera in a broadcast situation, assuming that there's enough light. You really might want to make sure that there's enough light. But fortunately, most of the situations where you're shooting professional video, there is. So either you're outdoors or you're somewhere where you've got stage lighting that does provide adequate light. And so the camera works just fine in those situations. I haven't had any real-world lighting issues with this camera. So, all right. So let's actually take a minute and take a look at the web interface on here. So switch over to my computer. One thing about this one is it was really designed around Internet Explorer. And so even though that's not the preferred browser these days, is the one. It's the only one that gives full functionality for this particular camera. Let's see, and I don't have the Activex Control installed yet, so I'll have to do that. I can take care of that real quick. So again, this is not the most convenient way to operate the camera, but it does give you some control. I did discover one little issue with this, though. Like when I have my own proprietary software running and the web interface here, and I move the control on my Xbox controller, it actually causes the web interface to crash. All right, so there we go. So we're getting really close to real time. Let's see if I can demonstrate. There. So there's a little bit of a delay on there, but it's not too bad. It's actually pretty reasonable considering that's coming over IP streaming. But you can actually control the camera here, so you can drag around this image in order to pan and tilt on there. And there's also controls for zooming there as well. If you use another browser such as Firefox or Chrome, it's much more limited in terms of the capability of controlling, and there's also a lot more latency and a smaller image. Let's see if I can remember my password here. Yep, there we go. All right, so the camera itself actually has this web interface built right into it. So has ways of automatically setting the date and time. It can be mounted inverted, so when you go into the installation thing, you tell it E-flip on if you have the camera mounted upside down. You notice here that the video format supports both SGI levels A and B, so it can be integrated into pretty much any video production environment, whether your switcher supports A or B. It also keeps a log of what's going on with the system, and then an access log to show what commands have been sent. In terms of configuring the video, we can set the exposure in here. We can also just adjust the white balance. You can see here I've got the exposure set, white balance set to manual. There's a high resolution mode which increases the sharpness in the picture, and then there's also an aperture setting here which provides additional added sharpness to the image to make it really look good. The video codec page is actually where we set up the IP streaming options. So you can see here that the primary stream on this camera is H.264 at 1920 by 1080, 30 frames per second. And then you've got some other options for configuring the codec itself. So you can specify the eye picture interval, which profile of H.264 to use. Image 2 and image 3 are basically additional streams. So you could, for example, be doing 2 separate H.264 streams, one at full resolution, one at reduced resolution. So if somebody's connecting in, they have little bandwidth, you can actually provide them a lower quality signal so that they're able to view it. The superimpose option allows you to do things like put clocks and whatnot on the image. However, it only works on the web stream. It does not appear on the SDI output. And then the final tab here is the day or not ICR. ICR is the feature built into the camera that allows it to shoot in very low light situations. So it switches to an infrared mode. You get a black and white image as a result, but it's able to see in situations where there is actually very little light. Normally I leave that mode disabled, but it is there in case it's ever needed. So the audio options, again, these are only for the internet stream. The audio is not included over SDI. Network, configure things like IP address. It supports quality of service, and so if you need to make sure that your video takes precedence over other things that are streaming out on the internet, you can do that with the QoS. Security, set it to your login password. PTZF control, this is how you control the pan tilt zoom on the camera. This is actually pretty much, well, this first option is only for the web interface. Digital zoom allows you to turn the digital zoom feature on and off. Focus mode allows you to change how the focus is done. So there's other options beyond this. It's not visible in the web interface, but the camera has some options like, for example, only doing autofocus after it completes a move. So after a pan or tilt or zoom. And then once it's locked on the focus, it stays there, or there's continuous autofocus. Again, those options are not listed here. Preset position, the camera has built-in presets. I don't find them as super usable. The serial tab lets you set the baud rate for the RS422. And then lastly, the final option here is streaming. It does support multicast. It supports RTSP. So it gives you ways of streaming video out to the internet. So that in a nutshell is the web interface for the camera. Again, as mentioned, you can do some panning and tilting right from that first live tab that was there. So you just take your mouse or touchpad, click, and then drag, and that will actually move the camera, physically move the camera around. All right. I'm going to go over my own software that I wrote to control this in a minute, but before I do that, we take a minute and talk about the upgraded model for this. Sony has fairly recently announced the SRG-300SE, which is in the same line, but just a little bit fancier than this one. Some of the things that it adds, first of all, it adds power over Ethernet natively, so you won't need a power over Ethernet box like I'm using in order to power the camera over its Ethernet jack. It also has an HDMI output in addition to the SDI output, so you can output to two different video formats. It has what they call a trace capability, and what that means is I want to go from preset 1 to preset 2 to preset 3, and then the camera does a nice smooth motion between all three of those locations. This one does not have that built in. The 360 also has a tally light, which this does not, and the 360 SE also supports stereo audio, whereas this one is just monaural. So not a lot of differences. That camera is not available in the United States yet, and I haven't even seen pricing on it, but expect that it's obviously going to be more expensive than this. Speaking of price on this camera, it's about $2,700 street price. And it seems to be about the same everywhere, where you're looking at B&H, Adorama, Amazon, all of them. They all seem to be right at that $2,700 mark. Every once in a while, Sony will do promotions on it. I actually was able to get a rebate on mine, so keep your eyes out for that. All right, so one of the things that I've been able to do, because Sony makes the documentation available on how to control this, is I wrote my own software that uses an Xbox controller in order to control the camera. And you've probably noticed throughout this and my other videos that I'm able to control the camera from that. So let's actually just jump in and take a look. Okay, so if you notice here, there's actually two windows that are up on the screen. The one on the left is for camera number 1, which is the one that we've actually been looking through. And then the one on the right is camera number 2. It's the one I've been looking at, the one that's sitting here on my table. I'm able to switch between these two by holding down the B button and then using the shoulder buttons on the controller. The active camera shows up in green. The inactive cameras, if there are more than one or more, those show up with a gray background. If I want to just move the camera, I just use the thumbstick on the controller. So let's punch in here and show. So the first thumbstick, the left thumbstick, is the faster movements, and then the right thumbstick is your slower movements. The minimum, you can get to the minimum speed of movements by using the D-pad. There are also two modifier keys, A and B. So if I want to move really fast, I hold down A and then move the left thumbstick. And if I want to move moderately fast, I hold down B and then move the left thumbstick. So movements are handled there. The software also has capabilities of controlling all sorts of other aspects from the camera from the controller. Like for example, if I need to control the exposure, hold down the right thumbstick and then use the D-pad and shoulder buttons in order to adjust gain, iris, and shutter speed. So again, plenty of other options. I can also select and record presets from the controller. So most of the stuff that I need to be able to do in the software can all be done from the Xbox controller through various combinations of buttons. And just make it a little easier, I've actually written in marker on the controller what some of those shortcuts are. All right, so back to the software. Okay, so upper left-hand corner, we can choose the white balance. Of course, auto, indoor, white, one push, which is basically manual. ATW, which is Sony's. It's auto tracking white balance. It changes. It's an automatic white balance where the changes are slow over time. So if you're shooting outside and, for example, the sun is going down, that will automatically adjust white balance slowly. And then the last one is manual. When manual is selected, we can set the red and blue gain values manually. For auto exposure mode, we've got auto, manual, shutter priority, iris priority, and then what Sony calls bright. Their brightness setting is basically it's an automatic white balance, or sorry, an automatic exposure mode, but you select the overall brightness, and then it comes up with the right combination of shutter, iris, and gain in order to achieve that desired level of brightness. When the exposure is set to manual, we've got these drop downs here. And again, as I mentioned, I can also control this from the controller. So for example, if I want to change the gain, I hold down the right stick and then move left and right, and that modifies the gain value on there. The wide DR is wide dynamic range. That's actually one of the cool things about this camera. It's not available when you're set to manual exposure, but what this essentially does is it allows the camera to shoot into situations with a very high contrast between background and foreground. So for example, you've got a conference room where the subject is only lit by room lighting, but there's a window behind him which has the sun. Obviously a lot of difference in the brightness of the sun and indoor lighting. This wide dynamic range feature will actually try and compensate for some of that and actually give you a usable shot. It's a little weird looking, but it does work. It's nice to have that there as an option, though not something that I would use on any regular basis. All right, moving on to aperture. This is basically Sony's sharpness setting, and I've got it set to the default of 8. It ranges from 0 to 15, so I'm right smack dab in the middle. Below that, we've got a series of on-off options. Steady shot is Sony's optical image stabilization technology, and as I switch that on and off, you'll notice that the image zooms in and out, and that's because the stabilization is not happening optically. It's being done electronically, and in order to steady the shot, it actually has to crop in order to give it some room to move around. So I normally leave that off, though, because typically these cameras are mounted on tripods that are out of the way and people aren't going to be bumping them. But if you're in an environment where your floor isn't super steady and people walking by do cause the camera to move around a little bit, turning on the steady shot there could actually make the shot a little smoother. All right, high sensitivity gives you additional sensitivity for low light. Defog does what it says. It tries to remove some of the haze or fog from shots. So if you got a situation where you're shooting where you've got a lot that's washed out due to fog or whatever, you can turn that on. ICR is it's that mode where it uses infrared to be able to see in near darkness. And then auto ICR will tell the camera to automatically turn that ICR mode on or off as needed. The camera normally is autofocus. I find that the autofocus on this camera actually works pretty well. I haven't really had any situations where the camera misfocuses on me. It seems to be pretty good. Part of that's because it is a small sensor, and so it's always got a fairly deep depth of field, and therefore small focus issues tend to not show up a whole lot. All right. Then we have these two options, and the one below are disabled because I'm on manual exposure, but if I was on auto exposure, there's a slow shutter option, which basically keeps the shutter open longer to gather more light when you're shooting in really low light situations. Backlight compensates for a backlit subject, and exposure compensation allows you to adjust the automatic exposure by plus or minus 10 dB. Sorry, plus or minus 10 stops, not dB. So yeah, if you're using automatic exposure, you can set your exposure compensation to compensate. There's also a noise reduction feature built in. 2 is the default, and it seems to work pretty well. It gets rid of some of the noise in low light shots, but not so much that the picture is really softened too much. The camera actually additionally has an on-screen menu. So here's that menu. I've got the software set up where I can actually control that with the thumbsticks. However, this is not super useful. It's much easier to navigate, much easier to use the software or the web interface in order to navigate that. So I included it for completeness, not because it's actually that useful. Okay. All right, and then below that we actually see the communication going on between the camera and the software. So, for example, if I move whenever I move one of the sticks, it's sending out a series of commands in order to make the camera perform that particular action. So you can see that communication going on there. I thought it was really nice of Sony to include the documentation on how to communicate with this camera in the documentation for the product on their website. So it's just one of the documents that's available under the Resources tab of the product support page, and they've got the full documentation on how to communicate with the camera, and it's actually not too hard. It took me a little while to figure out how to do it over IP versus RS-422. There's a few things that you have to take into consideration, but the information is all there. You just have to piece it together in order to make a usable product out of it. So, all right. So, next thing we have up here is I've got 8 camera presets. These are the presets that are built right into the camera. I really don't recommend using these. And the main reason for that is these presets not only record the position of the camera, including your zoom, but it also records things like your white balance setting, your exposure setting. And so if you're shooting in a situation, say for example, you're shooting in a building that has windows in the room where you're filming, the sun might hit the window part of the day, and you would normally need to adjust your white balance a little bit because the sun tends to be more blue than indoor incandescent lighting or fluorescent lighting or whatever you're using. So you need to adjust the white balance to compensate for that extra blue light coming through the window. You also obviously need to adjust exposure. So the problem with using these built-in presets is that it includes those settings for your white balance, exposure, etc. And so you may find that using one of the camera presets that your shot becomes, the white balance is off and the exposure is too hot, or it's not hot enough. You end up with basically an unusable shot, even though you're working from presets. So when I did the presets in my software, it does record the exposure information, but it does not record white balance, and including the exposure settings on recall is a configurable option. So if we look at the software, I've got a checkbox down here that says set exposure on recall. So with that checkbox not unchecked, when you go to recall a preset, it's only recalling the position, zoom, and focus. It's not adjusting the exposure or white balance at all. So It'd be something that'd be nice to have Sony actually include in their cameras, in their preset capability. Say, don't include the white balance, or don't include the exposure settings, or at a minimum, don't recall those settings when I'm recalling a preset. So, with that said, though, beneath the camera presets, which are these 8 buttons here, we have built-in presets. I can use the start button on the controller and then the D-pad to navigate through those. So for example, if I go to this one, I can press left on the D-pad and the camera jumps immediately to that location. So let me select, I will select the second preset here and recall that and hit left, and so there we go. That actually brings the camera back to me. If we go to the third preset, that will take us over to the equipment rack. And you notice that it's actually pretty fast when it's making those movements. When I recall the presets in this way, it moves as fast as it can and still be precise. So it may not move at maximum speed, but the way that it works, it's actually recalling the exact position that was recorded. So let me jump back to where we were. But instead of using the prior method I used for recalling the preset, I'm going to hold down start and press arrow right, which, if you look at the software here, I've got a time of 7 seconds in order to recall that preset. So switch back to the camera here, and then I'll hit start and the right arrow, and it will take 7 seconds in order to return to that preset location, which is the view of this other camera. So the downside to that is that these cameras at this price level do not have the capability of recalling a zoom position at a certain speed. So the only way to guarantee that you end up at a specific zoom position, there's only one command on the camera that supports it, and that is set zoom position, and there's no speed option for it. So I did the best I could in the software here. I tell it to recall the zoom position first. So hopefully most of the time while it's doing the move to the preset location, it's at the desired zoom position at the end, but there's no way to make it smoothly move from a starting zoom to an ending zoom. It's just something the camera doesn't support. Sony's higher end BRC cameras do support that. These SRG, less expensive models, do not. So just something to be aware of. Alright, so moving on a little bit, we got over here it shows the current X, Y, and Z speeds. So X and Y are pan and tilt, and then Z is zoom. So if I zoom out, for example, it shows a -1. If I zoom, it shows a +1. If I hold the trigger all the way down, it goes to 7. So, like I say, there's eight different speeds, 0 to 7. There's also an off, which is treated a little differently, but I digress. It also records the pan, tilt, zoom, and focus positions, so you can tell at any time where your camera is actually located. These are in internal units. They're not in degrees. The preset names over here, those are in degrees, and it's plus or minus straight ahead. So a negative pan position is off to the left. A positive tilt position is up, and vice versa. All right, the other ones are diagnostic things. Although I do have a camera set up here, we're able to select the video format mode and turn on the E-flip mode, which is the mode you turn on when your camera is mounted upside down, say on a ceiling. All right, and then down here, after I click on the More button, here's a series of color adjustments. These are not normally exposed in the interface for the camera. For example, they're not in the web interface at all. You won't see the commands there, and I don't believe any of Sony's joystick controllers actually provide these capabilities as well. But what it allows you to do, it allows you to adjust the saturation for the whole shot or saturation for individual color channels. So, for example, if you wanted your reds to be a lot more saturated, you come over here and drag that upwards, and that would increase the saturation just for the reds. And this is actually being done by the camera. This is none of my other equipment. This isn't my video switcher. I don't have any video processors going on. This is actually being done right within the camera. In addition to saturation, we have adjustments for hue. Say, for example, we're shooting outdoors, and the grass is just a little bit too blue. What you can do is you can come in here to the cyan adjustment and then move it downwards, and that would actually take just that one color and make it more green. And so that's actually a pretty nifty capability. So it's not as capable as a full coloring console, but it's better than nothing, you know. Say your skin tones are just a little bit too washed out, you can come in here and boost the reds and the yellows just a little bit, give them a little bit of additional saturation, and make your skin tones look just a little bit better. So that's a nice feature to have. And again, something that's not visible anywhere in their web interface, but something the camera is absolutely capable of. So nice little bonus feature that I was able to include there in the software. So the one other thing I have in the software is something I call a move. This is similar to that trace capability that the 360 SE has. So in order to access that, I hold down the back button, and then I can navigate any of these 3 preset moves that I have. It's simple. It's very trivial to record a move. I basically just hold down the back button and then press the X button to tell it I want to create a new move. Move the camera to where I want to go, where I want to start from, then hit Start button, and then at that point just use the normal joysticks in order to make the move. I can zoom in, zoom out, pan, tilt, whatever, even adjust focus, exposure, all of that stuff. It records all of the commands being sent to the camera, and then once you're done, you Start and Y and give it a name, and then it's saved for later recall. So in this case, I'm going to do this rack B2T, which stands for rack bottom to top. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to that camera. So right now I'm not on the rack, but as soon as I press Start or back and A, it's going to move to the starting position for that. And then when I press the Start button, it will actually perform those same moves that I had recorded earlier. I'll give you a warning, this was not the most smooth thing. It's something I did very quickly, but here we go. So I'll hit the Start button, and you can see the camera is actually repeating the same moves that I did before. So right now I'm not actually doing anything on the controller itself. That's all the software doing that. I had another one that I call RM Zoom, so I'll recall that. And then hit Start. So this is right monitor zoom. So again, this is a move that's being recalled. That's all being done. All that movement is being done by the software, and the Xbox controller is not involved in any of that. So that's a pretty cool capability that I was able to put into the software. Again, not a capability built natively into the camera, but it's something I was able to make it do because the software has full control over everything that the camera is doing. So anyway, this PTZ stick software that I'm working on, if there's enough interest, I'll actually make it available, sell it for a few bucks. I've got a lot of work on it at this point, and it's a little bit buggy because I'm the only one using it. It doesn't have to have the same refinement that a commercial product would. But if there's actually a lot of interest out there, then I can put it out there. Theoretically, it should work with other models beyond just the 300 SE. I'm sure it'll work with the 360 SE, and it probably works fine with the BRC cameras as well, though I don't have one to try that. And that would require a little bit of doing in order to make it communicate over RS-422 instead of IP. But again, it's not the end of the world. It's not a super difficult challenge to make that change. So anyway, the other alternative for controlling this camera is actually one of Sony's Joystick Controllers. They're about yay big. They're kind of expensive. The one that's specifically made for IP-based cameras like this one, it's called the RMIP10. It's about $1,800. You can control multiple cameras with it, though not more than one at a time. One of the nice features about the software that I wrote is that I can set it to record or I can set it to play back a move, and then switch to controlling another camera. So if I've got a series of preset moves that I want to use over and over again, I can recall one of those, select another camera, get a move ready on there. As soon as this first move is done, start the second move. And so one person can actually be controlling multiple cameras with one controller fairly easily. So something that you can do with custom software that the Sony joystick controller would not be able to do. So anyway, pros for the camera: really good image quality, relatively inexpensive compared to the alternatives that are out there, especially compared to Sony's higher-end models. There are some other manufacturers like Vadio and Panasonic and some others that are making similar products, but they're all in about the same price range, so you're not getting a particularly worse or better bargain by getting the Sony. I like the Sony because I use primarily Sony cameras, and this matches up really well with even my 4K cameras. So yeah, relatively affordable, small, lightweight, great control of the camera via the IP interface, and so I can control it over a network. The fact that I was able to power it over Ethernet is great, because now I only have to run SDI and Ethernet to each of the two cameras when I'm doing a production. Cons: it's a small sensor, so you're going to have a little more noise on this than you would a more professional camera. And then there's a couple of other little quirks, like I mentioned earlier, like anytime you change the direction of vertical motion, there's a little bit of a jump in it. And then as you zoom in, if you don't have your iris set properly, it can get a little dim on you. But again, that's an issue with other cameras as well, so I can't hold it against this one too much, especially at the price. So anyway, I do recommend it for anybody looking for a PTZ camera. I love the fact that it's IP based. That's just a great feature to have. Street price about $2,700. Shop around. I got my second one on eBay for about half of that, and so every once in a while there's some good deals out there. So anyway, if you have questions, be sure and leave comments below. I'll try and answer as best I can. I'm not an expert, but I'll at least put in a good effort, and I'll try. Like I say, I'll try to answer your questions as best as I possibly can. So anyway, thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe for other future videos. I will be doing video production videos with some consistency moving forward, talking about not just the gear that I have, but talking about why I've selected the gear that I have and my experience actually using the gear. I'm out there using this stuff all the time, and so I have real world experience with it, and let you know whether the product might look good on paper, but in real world it's a pain to use. I'll let you know. I'll be honest. I'm not accepting any sponsorships on this channel. This is all stuff that I'm paying for out of my own pocket through money that I'm making through doing productions. That said, if you're interested in having me do a production for you, be sure and leave me a comment, and we'll figure out a way to get in contact. I work primarily in Utah County of Utah, but I'm willing to travel for the right jobs as well. So anyway, thanks for watching, and have a great day.